Welcome everyone to our seminar series at the University of San Francisco. The seminar series is sponsored by the Data Institute, the umbrella organization of all things data science at the University of San Francisco. Our speaker today is Dr. Vivek Rudrapatna from UCSF, which is the University of California, San Francisco. He is a gastroenterologist and an assistant professor. His research team developed computational methods for using large clinical data sets, particularly electronic health records, to improve clinical decision makings. Today he's going to talk about an environmental cost-effectiveness analysis of methods for performing colon cancer screenings. Can I give him a round of applause?
Well, thanks to all of you for joining today. So without further ado, let's get started. And I'd like to acknowledge the many collaborators who have helped us on this project, including my longtime collaborator, Dr. Sean Wang, and a former graduate of the program, Andy Wang, who completed the master's degree just this past spring. So without further ado, let's get started. So some disclosures from me. I do receive grants from a few companies, Janssen, Alnylam, Merck, Genentech, Stryker, Blueprint Medicines, and Takeda, but otherwise everything else should be relatively free of bias. So to begin, as all of you know, we're living at the early stages of a looming climate crisis. And public health authorities around the globe have made the compelling case that this is probably the greatest public health threat that we face in the centuries to come. Climate change has its negative impacts on public health in a variety of ways, and this is kind of schematized here. So you can see here that it's a vicious cycle of rising temperatures, more extreme weather events, sea level rise, loss of fresh water, increasing CO2 due to risks of wildfire, etc. And all of these elements that contribute to each other in a vicious cycle contribute downstream to many adverse health consequences. So you can see here a lot of disease carrying organisms like mosquitoes can proliferate, increasing the chances of malaria becoming more of a global public health problem. We've got lots of aerosolized particles in the air that contribute to respiratory illness and worsening of asthma and other kinds of conditions. You've got diarrheal illnesses, which are a consequence of loss of fresh water and or disruption to sanitation, which is a major problem in the developing world. And lots of other things, famines that lead to forced migrations, other kinds of violence, etc. So all together, this is bad news. So here's something else, just to kind of really spell it out. We're projecting something like 250,000 people, unfortunately, will be affected by climate change in these various ways, costing something like $2 to $4 billion in direct damage to human health, projected by the WHO in 2030. And worst of all, this is likely to disproportionately affect those in our society who are least capable of being resilient to this. Children, the poor, indigenous, elderly, folks who work outside, pregnant and breastfeeding patients as well. So to dive into the world of healthcare, one of the ironies is that healthcare itself as an industry is actually a significant contributor to this global health crisis, which some estimates suggesting that something like 4.5 to 5% of global CO2 emissions that come from the healthcare sector itself. And in the US, something more like 8 to 10%. And so this also leads to some paradoxical problems down the road, which is to say, delivering healthcare, causing more climate change, causing greater needs for healthcare itself. So we talked about this, 4.6% of global greenhouse gas emissions, with 8.5% from the US. So the US, as usual, we're number one, but not in a good way, both on absolute and relative terms, that is to say per capita terms, where we are number one there. One thing to note, which is going to inform the study that I'm going to tell you about in a moment, is the fact that greenhouse gas emissions appears to be very closely linked to healthcare spending. And I think a lot of you know that US healthcare is also among the most expensive in the world, but not necessarily for the highest quality compared to many other countries. This leads us to an interesting idea, which is that it's possible or even likely that we can find ways to both save the healthcare system money and also to reduce environmental harms without sacrificing healthcare quality. And this is the kind of opportunities that we're looking for, opportunities to reduce waste, improve efficiency, and create win-wins for all of us. So in the search for opportunities to reduce environmental harms and also kind of overall improve healthcare value, we started with an investigation or a survey, you could say, of strategies for population health screening. These are tests that are recommended for everyone, the healthy and ill alike, unlike a lot of healthcare which is really focused on people who have chronic illnesses. And the idea here is that these kinds of things that are recommended for the general public at large, could yield a kind of multiplier effect. The harm reduction strategies here could really have a noticeable impact. So, me being a gastroenterologist, I had naturally an affinity to study colon cancer screening, which is one of the major population level screening tests that are recommended in the US and many countries. And we focus our attention here for a few reasons. The first is that colon cancer screening is recommended for everyone aged 45 to 75, which in the US corresponds to roughly 116 million people, almost maybe more than a third of everyone in the US. Moreover, public health authorities currently recommend multiple screening tests as all being acceptable for screening. So these include things like colonoscopies once every 10 years. They include CAT scans, which could be done every 5 years. And then they include stool-based tests, which can be done at home or in a clinical lab, the so-called fecal immunochemical test, or FIT. And so the idea here is that these public health authorities are recommending 3 different tests because they're all similar in terms of their efficacy and safety. And so the idea is that in the presence of some so-called clinical equipoise, where public health authorities are saying these are all good, we might actually find here that in fact they're not the same from the standpoint of environmental impacts or costs, and that finding evidence here might tip the balance in a way to promote more intelligent policies. So, basically, if we look for and find meaningful differences in environmental impacts across these tests, that could influence policy. And so with that in mind, we began a study about a year ago with the primary objective being to compare the relative environmental impacts of 3 different methods for performing colon cancer screening. And our secondary objectives here were to identify opportunities to reduce the environmental harms of each test. So the primary method that we used for this study is something called life cycle assessment or life cycle analysis, LCAs for short. And this is a standardized methodology that is primarily used in the worlds of industrial engineering and process evaluations. And basically, it's used to kind of quantify product and process impacts on the environment. So how do we do this? I'm going to outline for you briefly the steps involved in doing LCA. So the first is to define the study boundary. What are the things that we want to include in our analysis, all the products and processes that we want to incorporate. Once we kind of define that study boundary, we have to go out and collect primary data corresponding to the inputs and outputs of each of these 3 different screening tests under comparison. And to give you a little bit more of a tangible or concrete sense as to what that involves, it means literally going on site to these various places at UCSF Health, where we did this study, to assess what exactly is happening in order to provide colonoscopies for cancer screening, or to do CAT scans for patients, or to do these stool-based tests for colon cancer. So, just looking around, you see that obviously to provide healthcare, you need the lights to be on, right? So you need energy to operate, the lights and various electrical equipment that are needed to do procedures. You obviously need to have the equipment itself, which themselves are associated with a lot of manufacturing procedures in order to make them and to maintain them. Same goes with infrastructure. We have lots of disposable supplies, just huge quantities of things that we use once and throw away, right? And so what are all the things here in this trash can, and how do we kind of account for that? We've got reusable supplies too, and even though we all like to recycle, recycling isn't free either, and there's a lot of kind of costs and potential environmental impact there, and so how do we account for all of that? We've got personnel, we've got the patient, and we've got different staff, right? And they have to kind of travel to and from of the hospital, and how do we account for all those impacts. And then last but not least, we've got lots of medications. And so what are the costs needed to make them? So what we did at UCSF was spend time on site at these various different places where CAT scans and colonoscopies are done to try to document as comprehensively as possible what exactly was happening there. So that's the first two steps in a nutshell. Subsequently, we mapped all those elements to existing inventories that are basically curated from the literature. People who have spent a lot of time carefully analyzing the energy impacts and other environmental impacts of all the different products and processes, and basically kind of standing on the shoulders of prior giants, you could say, building on what they've done to kind of provide more refined estimates for healthcare context. So we did that kind of mapping, and then after kind of tabulating everything and running the math, if you will, we then are in a position to compare these different screening tests and assess which ones look worse, which ones look better. Subsequently, in order to kind of build confidence in our inferences, we basically performed a wide variety of sensitivity analyses, with the idea being that these analyses by their very nature have a lot of assumptions. We're never totally sure if they're right or wrong, and the best way to really be sure is to say, well, what if we were wrong about assumption A or assumption B? How robust are our findings? And then last but not least is a kind of feature importance assessment, which is to find what are the biggest driver of harms and how can we find more sustainable alternatives. So to dive a bit deeper, we're going to start by defining the functional unit. And so by that I mean, what are the costs associated with screening one patient for 10 years? So we're defining here very clearly, we're looking at a single patient level. We're looking at the time span here, which is 10 years worth of prevention of colon cancer. So we have to make, as you can imagine, a number of assumptions. So one assumption is that every health system is under either any of these trade-off scenarios, they're going to pick one screening method and really do it efficiently. So we're assuming that these health systems have some returns to scale, we could say. We're going to assume that the process inputs we're only going to look at those that are going to change under counterfactual scenarios. So certain fixed costs that are not going to be under our ability to kind of modify or remove, we're going to assume that those are fixed costs and not really include them in the analysis. We're also going to do what's called a cradle to grave assessment. And so here on the right, you can see the different kinds of assessments that are possible in LCAs. But really what we're trying to account for here is the total accounting of all energy or environmental impacts. What are the costs needed to extract raw minerals and materials from like the environment, what's needed to kind of process and refine these things, to produce them, to transport them, use them, and then ultimately dispose them. So that kind of comprehensive assessment is what we're looking for. We have to make, of course, more assumptions, and so I just want to kind of enumerate them here just so that you all know. So for now, we're kind of assuming that all tests are completed without ambiguity and they're all negative for cancer. No special maneuvers, no special sedations needed for patients, no follow-up tests for positive results. How do we go about capturing a lot of this data, particularly the energy-related data? So what we did was we used a combination of facility-level meters to document what the energy consumption was per unit time at these various facilities. We also used little devices that can be directly plugged into outlets to measure, how much energy is being used when you plug in your laptop, when you plug in your colonoscope, et cetera, into the wall, to really, in a very granular way, understand what energy utilization is like. We weighed and we photo documented all materials, and we did so twice using different members of the study team to create some semblance of inter-reader reliability. We accounted for patient and staff transport using Google Maps. And I just want to provide a last caveat here before we dive into results, which is to say that results I'm going to present today are interim. There are some little pieces that are missing, but I think nonetheless we'll still be able to provide some interpretations, as we'll discuss shortly. So I've talked a lot about mapping documented elements into existing databases. The one that we used as a very popular one in the literature is called EcoInvent. And basically, as a lot of you know, in the EU, there's a lot more emphasis on being sustainable for the environment, et cetera. And so they've actually placed a lot of guidelines that basically force companies to be much more transparent. As a consequence, over many decades, they've really built up a very nice resource of basically almost everything you can possibly imagine in the economy. Mining, agriculture, electricity, water, construction, you can see all these categories. So there's something like 18,000 elements in this database, and the task becomes how do we map the things that we document in a healthcare setting to something that someone else has studied and validated and vetted as an input into our modeling. So what's nice is that this database kind of accounts for all inputs to the inputs. So it's like you can look up, what are the costs needed to transport someone 1 kilometer using a standard size passenger vehicle. And so that element in EcoInvent takes into account everything, like what are the cost needs, like make cars, transport cars, gasoline, heterogeneity or variation across different manufacturers, et cetera. It accounts for all of that. And I just use that little piece, if you will, to build this larger edifice that now speaks to the cost of providing healthcare, essentially. So this is what EcoInvent is in a nutshell. And what's nice is there are lots of little features that allow you to customize it based on global geography and uncertainty. So it's very good. It's not perfect though. It doesn't contain information on every single project process in the global economy, and it's not totally validated. So when doing these kinds of assessments, it requires a little bit of expert judgment and lots of sensitivity analyses to really be sure that the conclusions are valid. We had, in some cases, to deal with issues of so-called composite materials. So this is something that almost everyone in this room would recognize immediately, right? Face masks, having come out of the pandemic. But as you can imagine, these are not simple things, right? These are really composite materials that are composed of various kinds of fabrics to provide protection, right, from the air, and various adhesives and elastics that go around the ear, et cetera. And so you might not find the element face mask in your database. So what do you do then? So what we did was basically chose the so-called dominant material. So here, if most of the weight of the face mask is really this particular fiber, then this is what we're going to use in the database and ignore kind of other elements. This is kind of how we were able to make the study feasible. We assume that laundered materials are reused 75 times before they're thrown away. And we keep track of all elements where we weren't sure, because you can imagine there's a lot of uncertainty with going from things in the world to things in a manufactured sense. And so keeping track of all that was critical when we went into the sensitivity analysis phase. So last, how do we measure outcomes? So we're talking about environmental harms, but that's a very vague thing. Like, what does it really mean to harm the environment? So the good news is that a lot of smart people over the years have thought about this, and the dominant score that's often used in this literature is the so-called recipe score. It's widely used in Europe and used elsewhere as well. And so what you can see is they've tabulated literally every single way in which things that we do can create environmental harm. So we all know about global warming potential through greenhouse gases, but there are lots of other things that we do, right? We can toxify the water, we can reduce the ozone, we can strip the land of minerals and other resources, we throw particles into the air. And so if we tabulate everything and then quantify how all of that impacts human health down the line based on these various mechanisms or other kinds of harms, these are ways in which we can go from a kind of qualitative concept to something that's very precise and quantitative. So for this study, we focused on 2 outcomes. One is global warming potential as measured by kilograms of CO2 equivalents. So that means like CO2 or other things that have a similar effect, like methane, nitrous oxide, et cetera. But we also focus on damage to human health. And so this uses a very interesting measure called disability adjusted life years as of 2010. Now that sounds a bit cryptic, but to give you a very brief overview as to what it is, it's a way of quantifying harms to human health in a way that goes beyond just lifespan. Meaning it's not just about how long you live, but what's the quality of life. So if you kind of apply weighting factors to account for the fact that people who are living with chronic illnesses or disabilities are not able to live the same full, complete, vibrant lives that they otherwise would, these are ways in which we can quantify harms in a way that helps inform public health authorities as to what we should do. All right, so that was a lot of a background. Let's talk about results. So we spent some time looking at UCSF Health and seeing what people were doing. We documented 138 different input elements across 3 tests, and they're roughly categorized into these categories here. Some elements admittedly are a bit technical, like phthalates and dipropylene glycol methyl, but a good amount of Googling and consultation with other LCA experts helped us to kind of make the mapping as rigorous as we could. And so you can see here across the different kind of elements we captured, the different ways in which these things are contributing to global warming as one of our outcomes. So once we have all this kind of inventory locally, we in parallel create kind of process map. So what does it take to do a colonoscopy or to perform a CAT scan of the colon or to do a fit test? And so basically we created this process map which involves these different categories: reusable materials, single day using materials, things that we throw away, transportation, energy use, basically how patients kind of come in, get the procedure, and then subsequently leave and things being reprocessed. So this is the kind of comprehensive mapping that we did. And as I mentioned, we also collected information as to where people live. And using a combination of zip codes from staff and patients, calculated the mean round trip distance that would be needed for people to travel via mostly gas-based transportation to UCSF. We calculated that to be roughly 56 kilometers. So after boiling all the numbers, what do we finally find? So our primary analysis, which you could say is our best guess as to what's going on, suggested that this is the relative impacts of these 3 different tests. So you can see here that there's one clear winner, which is the FIT test. These are the kind of annual stool-based tests that are used for colon cancer prevention, and that these result in 2.5 kilogram of CO2 equivalents basically per patient who was screened over a 10-year period. And the damage to human health is very small on the DALY scale, that is disability adjusted life years. Intermediate is colonoscopies, which is basically 40.84 and 0.32 respectively. And then last is CT colonographies. So these are the results of our primary analysis. And what you can see here also is that on these 2 scales, they're almost the same, which perhaps makes sense that the ways in which we're creating the greatest harms to our future selves in terms of human health are really mediated by the fact that we're making the globe a warmer place. And so to simplify things, we focus a lot of the downstream analyses just using global warming potential. So we then moved on to our sensitivity analyses. So there are different ways that one could do this. One could do this in a kind of statistical sense where you say, okay, this is the input that's uncertain. This is the kind of error distribution, it's normal or it's right skewed or something. You basically kind of use resampling techniques in Monte Carlo to kind of get a good sense as to if you really believe that these differences are meaningful, or if they could be attributed to the fact that we're making lots of assumptions that we're not sure about. We elected to take a different approach, which could be seen as potentially better if the assumptions hold. And that is to say, forget about looking at the distribution. Let's look at the very worst thing that could be the case and the best case scenario. And by comparing different tests according to a worst case, best case framework, we were hoping that we would be able to draw some good conclusions. And it seems to bear out as we expected, which is to say, even under 71 dimensions of uncertainty, what we were able to find in EcoInvent, the worst alternative and the best alternative for a given input, FITs really do seem to live somewhere in this 2.5 range on the global warming scale, and almost certainly better than the other 2 tests. Colonoscopies, again, generally seem to be better, but you can see here that the worst case colonoscopy is slightly worse than the best case of CTC. So we could, I guess to be precise about it, say that we're not totally certain that colonoscopies are better than CTCs. There's some room for doubt. But I think what we can say is not only are FITs better, but they seem to be an order of magnitude better. So even when considering certain unknown unknowns with this whole modeling process, that it's unlikely that FITs are going to be the same or worse than colonoscopies. They're probably the best. And just another kind of footnote here, which is to say, as I mentioned before, the CT results are interim because there are some things that are missing, which is to say, it turns out that an important driver of all this is actually the energy we use to kind of keep the rooms cool, so the HVAC system for AC. And it turns out we haven't yet accounted for that. So once we do, it's very likely that all three of these bars at the top are going to go up even more. So just to kind of give you an idea as to what's happening there. So as I mentioned, these things are very complicated. And so as the usual strategy is to start simple, and once you get a handle on things, to gradually make it more complex. So what I initially proposed with this project is that we start under a very simple, naive paradigm. We assume that people just get tested and they're negative, and that's it, right? But in reality, we know that some patients will test positive, and they need further evaluation to see do they actually have colon cancer or a large polyp that needs to be removed, right? And so how can we take that into account to make this more realistic? So we did some review of the literature, and we found that the range of positivity for these tests is something like 7 to 14%. So what happens if someone does a stool test at home for colon cancer and it's positive? Well, then they have to go to a gastroenterologist and get a colonoscopy to investigate what's the cause of this positive test. Do they have cancer? Do they have a polyp, et cetera? And so the right way to think about it is, you could say, a bit like a state-based model going forward in time. So if you're in the screening colonoscopy paradigm, then once you turn age 45, you get a screening colonoscopy. If the test is negative, then you come back again in 10 years, right? If you get a fit test and you happen to be one of the lucky ones who test negative every year for 10 years, then you just keep on moving along forward in time until you hit year 10. But at any point in time, if you do come up positive, then you get shunted to the colonoscopy path where you have to get evaluated further. So the idea here is that if we're really comparing a fit-based screening strategy versus a screening colonoscopy strategy, we can't just account for the cost of fit alone. We have to also add some cost because of the small probability that patients may need a colonoscopy as well. So we refined the kind of estimation procedure to account for this. And we did so once again under a worst case scenario framework, which is to say, let's assume that all of our patients do everything we ask them to do. There's 100% compliance with this annual fit test, that the very worst positivity rate is actually the case here, 14%. Let's assume that it's fixed over time, which is in fact not the case. Usually these things go down over time. So if you make all those kind of worst case assumptions, you'll find that 78% of patients actually will get at least one colonoscopy over a 10-year period. So, again, it raises the possibility that fits might actually paradoxically be worse because so many of them are still going to need colonoscopies anyway. But it turns out that when you do the math, just because of the magnitude of that difference, as I was saying before, that kind of order of magnitude difference, that even in the presence of a 78% colonoscopy rate, fits are still going to be better. So that was an important kind of check for us to do. You can do the same thing with CT colonographies, and as you would guess, these are going to end up being worse because now they're, some 30% of these patients are going to end up getting one colonoscopy over a 10-year period. So that was our kind of primary assessment, which is comparing these different tests. But we want to move into a more granular analysis and understand what are the real drivers, what's causing all the badness of these different tests, and how do we mitigate them, right? And so we basically did, you could say, a feature importance assessment, and looking at just the top 7 supplies or inputs to each of these screening tests, what you're going to see as being quite striking is that transportation of patients and staff was like far and away the biggest problem, actually. That surprised us, I would say, because we spent a lot of time in the hospitals. We see like the huge trash bags coming out every single day, and we figured for sure it was going to be something like that. But it wasn't that. It wasn't even the HVAC system. It actually was like the fact that people drive to and from the hospital that actually was causing such a bad kind of negative impact here, both on the global warming scale and the damage to human health scale. So just like before, the impact here, looking at 21 versus 3, 1, etc. So it's literally an order of magnitude greater than everything else. And it suggests, it was kind of reassuring. Oh, go ahead.
I think I don't think the graph lines up with the numbers on the right. Maybe you got 21 and 41 backwards. I think each other spots.
Yeah, you're right. The axes are, I think, mislabeled. Thanks for that catch. I think this is, the axes need to be fixed. But for what it's worth, just to say that, the methods that we used here obviously made many simplifications. So certain kinds of disposable materials like biopsies we didn't pay attention to. But in a way, looking at this result, it reassures us that in a way those things are kind of ignorable because the biggest problem here really does seem to be the cost of transportation. So we then kind of did a further analysis to ask the what if question. So what if we all switched from conventional gas-based locomotion, if you will, to electric cars? We found, once again using the EcoInvent database, that this has already been modeled out, and it appears that making that switch could result in a reduction of impacts by something like 34%. And so that is the nature in which we could potentially make the situation better. We did other kinds of analyses too, like in colonoscopies, for some idiosyncratic reason, we use a lot of sterile water. I know this is going to sound a little gross, but trust me, the colon is definitely not a clean place. And there's absolutely no reason why we shouldn't be using regular tap water. And making a simple switch from sterile water to tap water that is fine for drinking makes a nice difference there too. There are, of course, other policy alternatives that are definitely better than current practice. So you don't need to do an LCA or use any complicated modeling. Common sense will tell you that it's better. So obviously, not leaving the lights and computers and HVAC on at night could probably save a ton of CO2 equivalents. And reassessing kind of other processes that don't really have definite utility, things that we just kind of do for habit, but not for clear benefit. We have to really take a hard look at it. So to dive into the discussion, as I think hopefully I've convinced many of you of, FITs really do appear to be the most environmentally friendly test, even under worst case scenarios. And they appear to be, this benefit is probably coming from the fact that they're very scalable, right? So these are kind of low resource, low intensive tests that can be mailed into patients and then mail them back. So no one really has to drive anywhere besides the mailman, right? And so, that I think is where a lot of the benefits coming from. And what's nice, as I was saying before, is there really does seem to be a correlation between environmental harms and costs. And it's pretty kind of well established that FITs are way cheaper than you can imagine all the costs needed to pay doctors and pay hospitals to do complicated tests. So it's a nice way to have a win-win, because usually when the environment goes head to head with people's pocketbooks, unfortunately dollars tend to win. But if they can both go in the same direction, then there's much less controversy with policy actions. So we were very happy about that. Global warming potential, as I mentioned, does seem to be highly correlated with human health. And that's nice because, again, if you have scenarios where things contradict each other, then it's what do you pick? But here, at least you can say we don't have to make that hard decision, that we can choose one thing that's going to ameliorate a lot of the downstream consequences of harming the environment. LCAs are associated with many significant uncertainties, and I think probably all of you have been feeling that over the last 30, 40 minutes, and for sure it's true, there's no doubt. And what's interesting, at least to me as a data scientist who's coming into this kind of area of research, is the fact that we often encounter other kinds of uncertainties than we ordinarily are used to seeing in traditional kind of data-driven statistical kind of framework, right? These are not uncertainties that are the consequence of sampling error. It's well, if we surveyed everyone in the US who they're going to vote for, we would have no uncertainty. But because we did a 1% sample, how do we know how it's going to extrapolate out to the general population? This is not a sampling level uncertainty. This is an epistemic uncertainty, known unknowns and unknown unknowns, to borrow the famous Donald Rumsfeld quote. So, these it's a different kind of problem, and something that we have to kind of grapple with. Modeling can help a bit, and very sophisticated, statistical tools, et cetera, can help. But it's like a lot of paradigms. I think in the end, if you have really high quality, rigorous data collection, that can probably supersede a lot of the analytical methods that we use often in a secondary sense. So where does this data have to come from? Fundamentally, in my view, a lot of it has to come from supply chain vendors, right? All the things that we kind of buy and all the things that we throw away. We don't really have any transparency in terms of how that's being conducted. And in places where kind of governance at a kind of multinational level like the EU or at a statewide level, those kinds of political bodies have a lot of authority and influence. And you can see in places where those traditions are in place, there's a lot more transparency and it allows for better decision making. And so I think that's the kind of philosophy we need to bring to bear here in the US. So doing LCAs requires financial resources. It's expensive to kind of figure all this stuff out and to do the necessary thinking and modeling and reporting. It also requires transparency, right, as we talked about. Businesses are typically not going to volunteer this information unless they have to, as you can imagine. And customers, of course, like governments are always ideal because they have power. But customers have some power too, particularly large ones like universities. And so I think as we move into an era where companies and other nonprofits, universities, et cetera, are taking a kind of broader scope as to what they think their missions are, not just like profit motives alone, but also kind of thinking about societal impacts, environmental impacts, et cetera. You can imagine that there is some opportunity for leaders to be a bit more wise. For example, we don't do business with companies that don't provide LCAs by third-party independent auditors, right? These are policies that decision makers could use. So I think we've already talked about the EU and how I think there is a need for the US to kind of adopt some of these strategies. So of course, from a healthcare standpoint, it's always easy to kind of blame other people, for not providing information. But we shouldn't forget that, at least in a healthcare context, 7% of the problem comes from us. And so this does not obviate the need for us to be more rigorous in the way we collect data and analyze data and be accountable to ourselves and our patients. And so, this kind of project that I presented to you all today is kind of a research project, but at some point we need to go from like research land to standard business practice to operational land. And that's the point at which we can actually turn these things into policy changes and real world impacts. Identifying policy alternatives, just to make another kind of side point, required, in my opinion, a different skill set than many data science projects that I've been involved with in the past. So I think a lot of us in a conventional modeling paradigm, you kind of fit like a regression model, you look at coefficients, and that gives you some insights as to what the important drivers are. But here, it's a different kind of thing. It's like, we didn't sample multiple hospitals. We have like an N of 1, and we're basically kind of diving very deep into what's happening there. And so even though the future importance kind of found some influences of interest and can generate hypotheses, what was interesting to us is that it doesn't necessarily give us the prescription for what the alternatives are. It's like, you might find like coefficient number 1, i.e. transportation, is a problem. But then you have to go beyond the model to like your knowledge about the world and recognize, oh, there is an alternative, i.e. electric vehicles, let's see what's going on. But it's not something that comes directly from the model itself. It's a kind of different way of thinking about modeling with data. So as an example here, a different way the future importance could have played out for us is maybe finding that disposable gauze is a problem, right? But if like you go to Amazon.com and there is no alternative to disposable gauze, then what are you going to do? It's a kind of future importance without a policy alternative. And so being mindful and cognizant of that, I think, is super important. Finding alternatives obviously requires a diverse data set. And I think for those of you who have taken your regression classes, you know that like variability in your X variables allows you to stabilize your estimates of the target parameter. And when you don't have diverse data, when you just have very kind of homogeneous or even single centers of the data, you're not going to be able to learn as much as to what the alternatives are, right? And so I think over time we need to figure out how to scale these processes up to include more diverse data sets and learn from others who do things differently than what we do, right, at UCSF. And then of course there's like the gap from like pure data science land to like policy land, right? You might have a cool idea, but if you don't really deeply understand the process, if you can't consider unanticipated consequences due to simplification of your models, if you don't get stakeholders to really buy in, things are going to fall flat, right? And this happens all the time in political context and elsewhere, right? So as an example, I work for a health system. Like when I talked about saving the healthcare system money, what that really means is saving patients and payers money. The losers are actually physicians and hospitals. So how do you convince healthcare CEOs to switch to FITs when they're actually going to lose lots of revenue? These are other kinds of challenges we have to think about. So we've all talked about AI eating all of our jobs, but just to put it out there, AI can't solve these problems in my opinion, at least not in the near term. And all of you learning these core skills are going to be needed to help make these important advances. And last but not least here, how you frame the question can influence what you can discover. We focused a lot on marginal benefits and costs. So as I mentioned, if something's like a fixed cost that we can't change, there's no point really modeling it out because it's not going to influence how someone makes a decision. But if you really kind of narrowly focus on that kind of thinking, you can miss other things that could be important. So for example, you might say, well, you know what, the HVACs are always going to be on, you always have to keep in the room at a certain temperature, let's not even think about that, right? But if you ignore it, you might find that perhaps we could do better. Maybe we could allow for a little bit 1 or 2 degrees warmer than otherwise would be typical. Maybe it's tolerable and acceptable, and maybe it actually reduces a lot of the harms, right? In our case, we actually found that for some bizarre reason at UCSF, we had this storage closet, which is continuously ventilated, and it's in a weird place where it actually consumes an insane amount of energy, but we keep it on even when there are no scopes there. So again, total wastefulness, and no one's ever looked at this before because why would they? Things seem to be working fine. And so placing a magnifying glass, using that to kind of really shine a light on these things is very important to induce positive change. And then maybe a last thing I'll point out here is the fact that we're talking about these units that are seemingly understandable, but when you really step back and think about what actually they mean, it can be hard to interpret, right? So we talked about disability adjusted life years, and we have these numbers like 0.2 or 0.3 or whatever it is. But then when you really ask yourself, what does that actually mean? So we've got 116 million people in the US between 45 and 75. Let's extrapolate this up. Let's assume that everyone in the US gets a fit test as opposed to a colonoscopy. How many disability adjusted life years, how many DALYs could you save, right? So when you run the numbers, you find that quote unquote 34.8 million DALYs could be saved. But what does that really mean, right? Does it mean that everyone on planet Earth is going to live 1.8 days longer of healthy living? Not exactly. Does it mean that some people who have chronic illnesses are going to live way better because they don't have particles in the air that are causing asthma, right? Quite possibly. But I think in the end it's one of these things where there's a gap between math and reality. These are things that are hard for I think ordinary people to really wrap their minds around. But in the end we have to kind of trust that these kinds of interventions, at least on an ordinal scale, will help make the world better, right? We strive for harm reduction and basically trust that these things will, as I said, make the world better. Limitations, there are many. There are many uncertainties in primary data capture, and going forward, I think this needs to be done using so-called blinded audits with high degree of reliability. There's a lot of uncertainty in mapping elements that you capture in an in-person on-site audit with things that you find in a database. And this requires, of course, significant domain knowledge and information from suppliers. We rely heavily on the validity of eco-invents parameters. As I said, we're kind of standing on the shoulders of giants, and if the giants aren't so giant, that's a problem. And so in the end, the field has to kind of continue to make this a high-quality resource for researchers. This is, of course, a single-center experience. We need more replicates of each test to really understand variation, of which there is quite a bit. This is not optimally designed to identify and recommend policy alternatives, although that's kind of where we'd like this work to go. And we talked about these various other complexities with going from kind of data to action, unknown unknowns, complex systems involving people and unforeseen consequences. So I wanted to kind of end with a message more to all of you. Of course, many of you are not in healthcare, but hopefully a lot of you care about this. So how could you kind of involve some of this thinking or approach into your own work or your own studies? And what I would say is to look for opportunities to make your campus green. Not all trade-offs require a full-blown, insane analysis using, all this complicated software, right? Turning off lights and computers at night is an easy thing, right? It's a no-brainer. But at the same time, for those of you who are really kind of data-oriented and want to learn this, I think there's a lot of value here. And I think going forward, as the world kind of provides greater attention to these problems, surely there's going to be kind of a demand for data scientists who really understand this stuff. And hopefully that could be something that you could bring to the table once you're all in the job market. So there are lots of resources to learn this stuff for free on the web. EcoInvent has an educational license, and I think it's even free for students. And OpenLC is also is free. You can urge your institution to make greener choices with transparent vendors, and all else equal, give your contracts to vendors that supply sustainability data and analyses. And look for ways maybe to improve the way in which we do these analyses using data science tools. So for example, software that can help us bridge that gap between the manual data collection and things that are in standardized databases. So for example, Andy, who is one of the major drivers of this project, the former USF grad, he actually built a very nice script that automatically, sends API calls to Amazon to basically try to figure out in an automated fashion what are the primary constituents of these various healthcare materials and how can that be mapped in an automated fashion to LC databases. So that's one of like many examples of how you can bring a lot of your creativity and data science skills to bear on this kind of problem. Literature mining to maybe improve the quality of these databases. Ways to present the user with policy alternatives, sources from the web, perhaps, projecting the impacts, and many more that I'm sure all of you can think of. So in conclusion, we performed an LCA that compared 3 tests for performing colon cancer screening. We found that FITs are probably the best for the environment, and CTCs might be the worst. We found that across tests, decarbonizing transportation is probably the most important thing that we can do. And that minimizing energy consumption can probably both save the system money and save the environment. And last but not least, you too can help make our world more sustainable as both a data scientist and a citizen. So I'd like to acknowledge all my co-authors, including Andy Wang, as well as all other folks listed here, including Sean as well. The UCSF Health Office of Sustainability, the UCSF Earth Center, which provided us with some funding, and also Green Delta, these are the makers of the OpenLCA software. Andy created a very nice tool on Tableau Public, and so for those of you who want to check it out, please do feel free to scan it. And that's all I've got for you, so thanks for your time and attention. Happy to take any questions.
If you have questions, please line up on either end.
Hi, thank you very much for the presentation. It was extremely impressive. I was very curious about your personal opinion on how patients may, let's imagine that you present these results and the hospital says, okay, we're going to switch to a only fit policy. Like, I was very curious that because you consider the false positive result, or you need to go for a colonoscopy. So I looked up what's the false negative for fit test, and it's around 10%. So how do you account for the fact that many patients don't trust the results of their fit test and want a colonoscopy, yes or yes, because they want to be sure, especially because we are talking about cancer. So this may be impossible to model, but how do you maybe, what's your opinion on the emotion factor of patients?
Yeah, excellent. Excellent question. So we can say a few things. There are many tests. Public health authorities at this time, and actually for many years now, think that although there are some minor pros and minor cons of each relative to the other on purely safety and efficacy grounds, they think that they're all equally good, or close enough, you could say. So the U.S. Preventive Services Task Force is one of the most influential bodies in this regard, and essentially everything that U.S. healthcare pays for, like Medicare, Medicaid, and commercial payers, they all follow those guidelines. And so for what it's worth, both FIT and colonoscopies get a so-called grade A rating. You're right, there is a false negative risk for FITs. There's also a false negative risk for colonoscopies. GI doctors like to say that it's the gold standard, but it's not 100% protective against cancer. It's also true that colonoscopies don't just find cancer, but we find polyps, which are the precursor to cancer. And by taking those polyps out, it's widely believed that we are reducing the risk of cancer because we're nipping it at the bud, literally, right? However, large-scale population studies have actually failed to show substantial differences in mortality comparing colonoscopies to FITs. So there's like science, right? But as you say, there are gaps between science and perception or emotions, right? Patients might have strong feelings for something. Physicians might have strong feelings. In fact, physician opinions might not be unbiased. They could very well be conflict of interests, right? These are tricky. But sometimes payers have a lot of power, for sure. So a lot of you have heard of Kaiser Permanente. They are a very unique system because they're both kind of a payer and they're also a provider. So if you have Kaiser Permanente insurance, they basically are like fiscally on the hook every time you get sick, but they also provide healthcare. So their incentives are aligned, unlike the rest of healthcare, which is horribly misaligned, unfortunately. And in Kaiser, everyone gets FITs. So they just say that's it, it's just FITs, unless there's some very special or exotic reason not to do it. Patients don't always like it, but they kind of go with it. So I think that's the best I could offer.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
I have a really short question. Just for the LCA, so basically with more regulation coming, you mentioned the EU, would that like deviate the desire of this outcome? Like, would that like with more regulation implemented into this the healthcare system? Do you think that would like deviate the outcome? Like the global warming, maybe there will be another issue that will be the primary factor. That makes sense.
You're basically asking if regulation is going to affect the results of the LCA or the way in which we do it. Is that what you're asking?
Yeah.
The regulation that I see coming out, at least in this space, seems to be this like greater requirements that companies actually do LCAs or provide raw data. Like if they want to do business in the EU, they have to have that info. And that's why all these companies like EcoInvent and all those guys, they're all based out of Europe. And I think as that regulation kind of takes greater hold, companies are presumably going to want to fight for business, right? So if they come out looking really bad compared to their competitors, they're going to have to tighten up ship, and that can be done in any variety of ways. So those kinds of domain shifts could happen, and that you could imagine downstream result in some differences in these results. So we may have to kind of revise them as we go. But hopefully over time it'll be much less labor intensive to do this stuff. It'll be more scalable and automatable, particularly with higher quality data from vendors. And then we can kind of continuously assess how we're doing now, and maybe at some point the tables turn and some other test becomes better. Did I answer your question or did I miss it?
Just kind of.
Sorry.
Because I think for me like regulation, like for example in Australia, sometimes they would change up the patient protocol and those stuff. Like I was wondering would that like affect the testing of this type of disease stuff?
Yeah, I mean so.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
But nowadays how we find diseases is different compared to 40 years ago how we define diseases. So with the technology, we will have more advanced technology to define this part of disease, more cancers. So with technology, with the regulation out there, would that require or would that deviate this?
Yeah, certainly can. So as a few examples, it used to be very expensive to do genetic testing. Now it's very, very cheap, right? So everyone's getting it. And if you happen to come up positive with some risk factor gene for cancer, you're going to get enhanced screening way earlier. And so you're going to be out of that risk pool, and now your risk is changing, your false positive rates are changing, et cetera. As colonoscope technology gets better, we're seeing a lot of AI that's being adopted. Maybe polyp detection rates are going to go up. Maybe the optical equipment is going to require less reprocessing or more. A lot of countries are going to change how they manufacture these things. So yes, lots of things are changing in healthcare. Technology is improving. The ways in which we diagnose things earlier or later could change. Guidelines could change, right? So I said 45 to 75. For many, many years, it used to be screening starting at age 50, right? It used to be doing it every 10 years, but those surveillance intervals could change. New alternatives to all of these 3 tests could come out. So 100%, all these results could change over time.
Thank you.
Yeah. Go ahead.
You kind of touched on this in the earlier question, answering your earlier question, but for people who have predisposition to colon cancer, let's say, are you accounting for that population separately in your study, or was this true for people who are not predisposed?
Yeah, so this study is really aimed at people at average risk, people without elevated risk due to family history or something like that. And we focus on that because that's where the most healthcare utilization is happening. This is like a test that's literally recommended for everyone, as opposed to so much of healthcare which is primarily geared at people with illnesses, people who are already sick. So, in actual clinical practice, people who have family histories or things like that, they get colonoscopies, they don't get FITs or CTs, and they have like much more rigorous screening like every other year or things like that. But this study was basically looking for the biggest bang for the buck, and that's why we went for kind of a population health screening test.
Thanks.
I just have a question. So all of this was based on diagnosis. So my question is, what would be the environmental impact of actually treating the disease? Because all of this is, okay, how much you're affecting the environment by getting tested every few years. But what if you don't get tested? That way you don't add to like that environmental like damage compared to you get tested and then you gotta be treated like that. So I guess the question is there a bigger impact coming from actually being treated than being diagnosed and having just that one treatment compared to years and years of diagnosis?
Yeah, great question. We tried, when designing the study, to kind of pick something that would be relatively uncontroversial. We were talking about this before, like anytime you're trading off like environment versus money or like environment versus health, these are like decisions that no one wants to make and or will make it but not in favor of the environment, right? Because it's always easy to just like push off like the future, now versus the future is sort of what it comes down to, right? And so we didn't consider that kind of question, although one could. But maybe a related question you're asking is like, okay, once someone gets diagnosed, what are the different ways that someone could be treated and what are those trade-offs like, and are some better than others? Undoubtedly, there will be something. Healthcare obviously is a very rapidly evolving field. We're always coming up with better and better treatments, more effective treatments. And so I think we strive in most of healthcare to like find like the best thing, what is the optimal thing. And so if you only have one optimal thing, then you're really saying, okay, like, will I accept a suboptimal solution in favor of something else? And you get to this trade-off problem. Here's like one of the few scenarios where like there are multiple tests that some like governmental authority has said they're equally good on like most of the things. So it's like one of these things where you could, if you're lucky, find some environmental thing and like shift the balance. But otherwise, these other trade-offs are much more controversial.
Hi, sorry. So thank you for the talk. I think it's really interesting that hospitals are kind of taking this approach to kind of reflect on environmental impact. And I have a couple of questions. The first one is I was wondering what campuses was done at, because I know like newer buildings are often more like energy efficient. So I was wondering like if you did this in the future, would you find differences in like energy consumption between campuses? And then my second question is related to people driving from like 56 kilometers away to get a colonoscopy. And I was wondering why people are driving that far to get a colonoscopy. And so like the impact of driving was so big, like outnumbered other ones. So like if you could minimize the impact of driving from that far away and just have people get colonoscopies closer to where we live. Yeah, I don't know. I just thought that was that stood out to me a lot, that people were driving that far to get a colonoscopy.
Yeah, both great questions. Regarding the first, we basically assessed things based on where they currently are. So some were in newer facilities, newer buildings, some were in older ones. So it turns out that the CAT scans are all done at a relatively newer facility in Mission Bay. The colonoscopies are primarily done at Parnassus, which is like a very, very old campus they're going to tear down pretty soon and build a new one. For sure, there are some risks of generalizability to like other places where things are newer or older, and that's part of the need for this to be replicable, so that we can really assess that. That's the first question. The second question is also, it's a great point. And what it really speaks to is a few different things. Like one is like, it's kind of a supply and demand issue. Like how many people are like board certified to like do colonoscopies? It's kind of a limited supply for a variety of reasons, not all of which are good. And as a consequence, you have to kind of drive a long distance to kind of get these things done. And that's an important driver. Versus it's almost like the exact opposite, where you've got things that are like mailed to you and you put it back in the mail. So it's like no driving, basically, assuming that the cost of driving mail around is a fixed cost, if you will. So limited supply of gastroenterologists, limited supply of anesthesiologists and ambulatory surgical centers, and there are lots of other things that we could talk about, like there's there's a huge mismatch in like healthcare where there are too many doctors in urban areas and not enough doctors in rural areas, and unfortunately it reflects the fact that people who are like well trained and for better or for worse like wealthier, they just don't like to live in rural places, and so there are lots of incentives by the government to like repay like medical loan debt if you basically go live elsewhere for a bit. But for sure, there's like continued disparities like in the US and probably elsewhere too. And some states are trying to evolve. Like there are many states where actually non-physicians, like nurse practitioners, can do colonoscopies, et cetera. So we're trying to democratize that a little bit. But it's it's a limitation. You're right. Like it was a little bit weird. We were hoping to kind of find like some problem that like the health system itself could change. And like the thing that we found in the importance, future importance, was actually like a transfusional factor. It's like almost letting the hospitals off the hook, right? It's like, okay, not our problem, it's someone else's problem. But in the end, it kind of comes down to the fact that like healthcare itself is like very expensive and it's not scalable. You know what I mean? That's really like the root cause of it. It's like doing healthcare requires that like people, like patients and physicians, like meet somewhere physically in space to do things. And like almost, everything else, like making gloves at scale, making paper at scale, everything is so industrialized and hyper efficient, in a capitalist world, that's very easy to just pump it out, right? Very cheap. But you can't pump out healthcare that cheaply yet. So
I actually have one more question about like insurance coverage
Uh-huh.
for fit tests versus like traditional, and if there's like pushback from insurance companies or like, I don't know.
yeah,
I was just curious.
it's almost the opposite. Fits are way cheaper. And so I'm sure payers would love everyone to get fits. But these national societies have said, well, colonoscopies are really good, and so they're both acceptable. And as a consequence, everyone's forced to pay for colonoscopies. It leads to weird things where like patients will sign up and they won't even show up. They'll just kind of skip their appointment because like by law it's supposed to be free. Like even if you don't have insurance, cancer screening is supposed to be so important that it's actually free. So lots and lots of waste in the system, but short answer is like yes, they're both covered.
So I have just one more sort of another the driving question, which is that your analysis was car-centric, and ultimately why you didn't include other transit forms besides cars.
Yeah, great question. The eco-event database has a lot of entries that are devoted to transportation, and they're all kind of functions of like local geography, like modeled balance of different size vehicles and gas versus electric use versus hybrid use, et cetera. And so in like the primary analysis, we kind of used a quote unquote typical mix, a kind of weighted blend or mix of what cars are like right now in the Western US. They have a specific kind of designator for that in the database. And they have a similar kind of item that one can choose if one wanted to specifically model the electric vehicle kind of trade-off against the kind of the mix across vehicles. So it was just a kind of first step or a simplistic analysis. But in a more kind of richer, more complete analysis, we could look at various other things, use of public buses or the barge or other kinds of things that are relevant to Bay Area cancer screening versus elsewhere. So just a kind of a limitation or a first starting point in this journey.
I have another question regarding the false positive, false negative. Since fit tests are so low impact, have you tried to figure out what's the, maybe instead of doing one test per year, have you maybe thought about, okay, let's mail each patient 3 fit tests, so the probability of false positive on all 3 tests is very, very low. So you can skip that colonoscopy to check the result of the fit test. So maybe you can reduce the impact of an extra colonoscopy that you maybe didn't need to do. I don't know.
Yeah. I think what you're trying to say is like, can you do more clever things with existing technology to kind of minimize the need for other tests, basically?
Yeah, so instead of doing 1 test and if that test is positive, go for a colonoscopy. Maybe like do 3 tests, and if 2 out of 3 are positive, then go for the colonoscopy. I don't know.
Yeah. People you can imagine have done this like in spades, looking for all possible things. Like you can imagine, it's a biochemical test. There's some kind of like binarized like threshold. Like if you're higher than 20 like micrograms per deciliter, we're going to call it a positive. Otherwise, it's a negative. Should we dial it up? Should we dial it down? What are the anticipated consequences in terms of false positives and negatives? How many cancers are we going to miss? How many colonoscopies are we going to do that are a waste, basically, right? You can do multiple, but it's complex. And you can imagine, like, in a, conventional, like, in most studies, we have this, like, error distribution. You kind of just say, like, okay, it's just, like, random noise. But when you, like, dig deeper, like, what is the source of the noise? Like, is it, like, patient-level factors? Like, some genetic thing? Is it, like, foods that they're eating that are, like, biochemically interfering with the assay, causing, systematic false positives or false negatives, right? Is it like, these things are all designed to look for blood, like cult bleeding is basically what they're looking for. And so what if this person, is basically on a blood thinner, they're on aspirin, they're on anticoagulant for some other problem. They have some other minor GI bleeding from like the stomach and it's going all the way down to the intestines, but it's causing a false positive. It's not like the polyp is bleeding, it's that like the stomach is kind of slowly bleeding. So there are like many, many factors when you really dig deeper. And so what I'm trying to say in short is people have tried that and this seems to be the best that we can do for now in the absence of like really superior technology. There are things that use, like for example, combination of biochemical testing for blood, which is the FIT test, plus like stool DNA. Like are there polyps or cancers that are shedding like oncogenes that you can detect on a genomic assay and say, okay, this guy really is at high risk, we should do this. So people are continuously like pushing the boundaries of what optimality could look like. But yeah, does that help?
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you for your talk. This is a really exciting method. I was thinking about like an alternative or a hospital that's implementing FIT tests. You said that it's more efficient for the hospital, but it's also a lot easier for the patient. And I'd imagine that a lot of patients would be doing FIT tests if they're offered who otherwise wouldn't do a colonoscopy, which to Eric's point I think would lead to like more diagnoses and probably more colonoscopies. So thinking about like changes in the number of people who are actually taking the tests, if you're implementing different methods, is there a way to implement that in your model? Did you consider that? And like how do you go about considering like how many more people would be taking tests who otherwise wouldn't, that more FIT tests are being offered?
Yeah, that's another level of analysis that we had to simplify for this first pass. We did things like assuming that whatever we naively recommended, everyone would follow. Of course, that's not true. In fact, the problem is kind of way worse than that. It's not just like choosing FIT versus colonoscopy. It's like doing any screening at all, right? Screening is a really hard thing because like it requires like, being proactive. And it's one of these paradoxes where like everyone complains about healthcare in the US because we've been very reactive. Like we wait for problems, then we do very expensive things. We're not preventing problems and keeping people healthier for longer. But being proactive actually means like patients like recognizing that they need to like, take time off from work and like go to their doctor when they don't have any other complaint other than healthcare maintenance or preventative care. And people just aren't thinking about that. There's like no great system. I mean, we live in an era of technology, but there is like no push notification saying like, hey, you're 45, go get this done. So either you just like hear about it from friends and family, or you're seeing some doctor for some other reason and someone says, oh, okay, you're 45, now you need to get this done, or it doesn't even happen. So like we naively like assumed that there was 100% compliance. Like when we recommend it, someone does it. A very, very common thing with fits is like you're supposed to get it done every single year. You can imagine people have lots of things and they're not gonna get it done every year. So like there are many, many challenges and barriers. And of course this kind of behavioral preference or psychological preference, that's a whole other level that requires more assessment. So we're just getting started.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, does anyone else have any last questions before we end it? Okay, then we will give a round of applause.